I shall be reading today Coleridge's poem Work Without Hope. It is a sonnet, an unconventional sonnet. Why I call it unconventional, I shall be explaining right now. Now, this poem was written in 1825. 1825, that means it was 9 years before Coleridge's death. Coleridge was already a famous poet, a famous man, and still in this poem we have glimpses of Coleridge's past experiences of frustration, lack of enthusiasm, lack of spirit, etc. So, the title of the poem is interesting: Work Without Hope. We do every work with a kind of a hope. But what is that hope? The hope can be described or analyzed or interpreted in various ways. It may be a hope of a better or brighter future. It may be a hope to be one with the workings of the universe, the workings of nature, or it may be a hope of life. But if we do not have any such hopes, we shall desist from working. We shall stop working. We shall feel a kind of laziness, a lack of enthusiasm, which Coleridge says that he feels. 1825, I said, and Coleridge was approaching the last phase of his life. Should we say that he could feel that his end was approaching? Now, another thing we have to remember and point out, that is that this poem may be connected with an earlier and a more famous poem by Coleridge, which is Dejection and Ode. In Dejection and Ode, we find a same kind of hopelessness, a same kind of frustration. So, thematically at least, we can connect these two poems, Dejection and Ode, and this poem, the present poem that I am going to read today, Work Without Hope. I told you right now that this is a sonnet, but a different kind of a sonnet. Why different? Because this is not exactly a sonnet written in the Petrarchan or Italian form, nor is it a sonnet written in the English or rather the Shakespearean form. The rhyme scheme of the poem is unconventional, and I'll ask you to kindly note the rhyme scheme of the poem, which is AB, AB, BB, CC, DD, CC, EE. Now, if you look at the poem and if you note, if you examine the rhyme scheme, you very easily will understand the unconventional nature of the rhyme scheme of this sonnet by Coleridge. Now, let us read the poem. The sonnet is divided into 2 stanzas, 6 line and 8 line. The first stanza is a 6-line stanza, and the second stanza is an 8-line stanza. Let us read the poem quickly. All nature seems to work, slugs leave their lair, the bees are stirring, birds are on the wind, and winter slumbering in the open air. Wears on his smiling face a dream of spring, and I the while, the sole unbusy thing, for honey make not pair, nor honey make, nor pair, nor build, nor sing. Now, so the season is winter season, and each creature, however mean it is, each creature is busy with its work. The snail, the bee, and the bird, all of them are busy with their respective works. The poet perhaps suggests that they have their hope. They hope for a future. They work for themselves. They work for their progeny. Therefore, they are not idle. And even the winter is filled with hope. As the poet says, that the winter perhaps is dreaming of the spring. The winter knows that after it, the spring will come. So, the nature is happy. The nature is busy. The only unbusy creature is the poet. Why is he unbusy? Now, let us look at the last line once again, last line of the first stanza. Nor honey make, nor pair, nor build, nor sing. Honey, apparently honey refers to the bee, and the 2 other words, pair and build, they may refer to the bird. The birds pair and the birds build their nests, and the birds will give birth to the young birds, nor sing. So the poet himself doesn't make any honey like the bee, doesn't pair like the bird, doesn't build nests like the bird, nor does he sing as a poet is supposed to do. Now, well, this is the apparent meaning, but, well, the inner meaning, we can look at that. Honey, what is honey? Poetry is often compared to honey. Pair, meaning pairing of verse lines. Build may suggest building the structure of the poem. And sing, the poet sings. So the work of the poet, what is the work of the poet? The poet works, the poet, creates poetry. The poet is the creator. But today, Coleridge says, he cannot create. Like the other members of nature, he cannot create. The other members, the snail, the bee, the bird, they all create. They all are busy. But the poet is unbusy. Now the second stanza, yet will I cane the hanks where amaranth blow, have traced the font whence streams of nectar flow? Bloom, or ye amaranths, bloom for whom you may. For me ye bloom not. Glide rich streams away, and would you learn the spells that drowse my soul? Work without hope draws nectar in a sieve, and hope without an object cannot live. So there are references to amaranth. What is amaranth? Amaranth is a flower which is deep red, or the color of which may be scarlet. Amaranth has also a mythical significance. Amaranth as if has a paradisal, a heavenly significance. Amaranth may also be interpreted as poetic inspiration. The amaranth doesn't bloom for the poet, because the poet is feeling the want of poetic inspiration. He doesn't have the poetic inspiration. He doesn't feel the poetic inspiration. And where there is a reference to the river, well, the river also, the river flows, but for the poet the river of imagination perhaps doesn't flow, it has stopped flowing. The poet feels a lack of imagination. He doesn't feel that his mind is filled with imagination. Without imagination, the poet cannot have work, and therefore the poet is without any work. Because without imagination, poetry cannot be made. As nectar cannot be kept in a sieve. What will happen if nectar is kept in a sieve? A sieve with innumerable perforations. The nectar will gradually seep out of the sieve, and very soon there will be no nectar. Nectar in a sieve will be a very meaningless proposition. So the poet without his poetic imagination will be a meaningless entity. He is a poet because of his poetic imagination, because of his dream. This dream and this imagination together can enable the poet to create. But the poet cannot create. He knows where amaranth blows. He knows the regions where imagination can work. But in his mind, right at present, imagination does not work. And therefore, he is barren. For me, ye bloom not. For me, ye means the amaranth, the flower. Bloom for whom you may. For me, ye bloom not. Glide rich streams, river. We can say the river of imagination, the river of poetry, the river of sublime inspiration the rich river doesn't flow for him. With lips unbrightened. So lips unbrightened, well, the poet refers to himself. Pale lips, wreathless brow. I stroll, I roam about, I move about. And would you learn the spells that drowse my soul? Well, I feel a kind of a drowsiness in my soul. Drowsiness meaning lack of inspiration, which I feel. And hope, the last line, and hope without an object cannot live. So I do not have the hope, and therefore I cannot create. So the first stanza, the poet describes nature, its winter season. Each creature, however many it is busy with its work, but the poet is not busy, because the poet doesn't find his inspiration. Second stanza, there is a reference to amaranth, the mythical flower, the flower of imagination, the flower of poetic beauty, the flower of poetic creation, reference to the river, the stream, which may be the river of creation, the river of emotion or imagination. So neither the flower blooms, nor the river flows, the stream flows for the poet, and therefore the poet is unbusy, because there is a kind of a drowsiness in the heart of the poet. The poet's heart is under the spell of drowsiness, because he doesn't have any hope. He cannot find any hope. And without hope, there can be no work. Work without hope. So work of the poet depends on the hope of the poet. And what is the poet's hope? The poet's hope depends on his imagination, which perhaps has left the poet, the poet says. Now I told you right now that this poem can be compared with his earlier poem, which is, I told you the name, which is Dejection and Ode. Dejection and Ode, which is a more famous poet definitely. And in Dejection and Ode, you see, Coleridge wrote, this poem was written by Coleridge in 1802. So please note that this poem, Work Without Hope, 1825, the earlier poem was written in 1802. And in that poem too, Coleridge expresses his grief. What was the grief? The grief was due to Coleridge's feeling that he was missing the powers of creation. Creation comes only through imagination. And he feels, Coleridge says that he feels that there is a lack of an urge for creation. And therefore, he cannot write any more poems. So, imagination, as Coleridge says, imagination helps the poet to shape his poetry. Well, the experience of the poet cannot be shaped into beauty unless and until the poet feels his imagination. And Coleridge says in Dejection and Ode that he doesn't feel the joy. The one line from Dejection and Ode I can quote: "This joy within me dallied, lost in distress." And well, so this joy, that is the main thing, the joy, the inner joy of the poet, which helps him to create. And almost the same thing is happening to the poet now in 1825, that he doesn't feel the inner joy. And without the inner joy, he cannot find his imagination working. And without imagination, he cannot shape his experiences into beauty. Therefore, the poet is not working. Now, well, one interesting thing I shall be pointing out to you right now, that though the poet talks of his lack of work, in reality, he was, in fact, a very busy man. For 10 years, he was a very busy man, and I can point out, well, the amount of work that he was doing in the past 10 years. Now, in 1815, Coleridge drafted his great book Biography Literaria, and this was published in 1817. So from 1815 he was very busy with his work at Biographia Literaria, and then came other poems one by one in 1816 and 17, and lay sermons in 1816-17, and Hush in 1820, and in 1825 too came Aid to Reflection. Aid to Reflection, in fact, consisted of his lectures to the Royal Society of Literature, and there he lectured on the Prometheus of Aeschylus. So once again, please note, first Biographia Literaria, then lay sermons, then Hush, and in 1825 itself came his Aid to Reflection, which was a collection of his lectures on Prometheus of Aeschylus. So Coleridge, well, was a very busy man. We cannot say he remained unbusy. We cannot say that, well, he didn't find his imagination and therefore he could not work. So in reality, he was a very busy man. But why he wrote this poem in 1825, that is something else. That is a different issue. Maybe that Coleridge was not happy with his poetic creations. So the Biographia Literaria, or lectures delivered to the Royal Society of Literature, they were his great prose works. But perhaps Coleridge was trying to find adequate inspiration for a great poetic creation which he did not find in this period. But as I said, we cannot say that this period was for Coleridge a very lazy period, not at all. So the material reality of Coleridge's life and the state of mind of the poet are two different things. So by explaining or by narrating the material reality of the poet's life, we cannot perhaps assess what was going on inside the poet, in his inner self. And the poet speaks here of drowsiness. Now, well, drowsiness, his lack of inspiration. But in this period, well, Coleridge was rather living a life of satisfaction. He had to face, in earlier years, he had to face financial troubles, family troubles, and many other things. But, and well, of course, his opium had done some great harm to him. But now, well, in 1820s in 1825 itself, he was more or less a contented person, a happy man, because he was now living in the house of James Gilman. He was living in James Gilman's house, and he had more or less a peaceful life. But in spite of this peaceful life, he wrote this poem. Why? We do not know. And let me repeat, we can never say what was happening in the inner mind of Coleridge. Perhaps he was feeling that he could not write a great work of poetry because he did not find the inspiration to work on such a great project. Well, thank you very much. That's for today.